Good morning. I'm a little bit short on pictures, but I have a few equations, so maybe that'll compensate somewhat. I started a project with Kim Romney, who's an anthropologist at Irvine, and when I came to Irvine in 1970, we had a rule against departments. We hired a bunch of mathy types, and we had no departments, and so it was wonderful to work with anthropologists, sociologists, and so forth. The university forced us to have departments, but we had a nice period where they didn't do that. So I'm going to talk about cultural consensus theory, which is an area that I originated. And in the last 7 or 8 years, my students and I have really been pushing it. As you see, I passed out a sheet of a bunch of papers for people that might be interested in that. So because a lot of the people that do know about cultural consensus and use it in their work use a very primitive version of it, which was our first version. And so I'm going to spend a little time talking about that first version. Then I'm going to talk about the limitations that the first version has, and then talk about how we dressed up the model to include solutions to all of those things. Now, there was an issue of true-false. In other words, the earliest model worked with true-false, or in some cases with multiple choice. And we all know that we can collect continuous sliders and Likert scales and so forth. So more recently, we've developed consensus models for other kinds of questionnaire designs. And I'll cover that briefly at the end of the thing. So anyway, in the mid-'80s, Kim Romney and I developed this methodology. And the objective was to, if you have a small group of people that you believe share knowledge or beliefs or something, but you don't know what they are, but for a variety of reasons you think you can ask questions that may cover these beliefs and get answers from each of these people from these questions, we wanted a way to pool the information optimally to try to, first of all, decide if there is evidence that there is a consensus, and if so, to go ahead and estimate what the consensus is. Now, an essential feature of cultural consensus theory is that there's no requirement that the shared knowledge corresponds to some ground truth. There is, of course, a lot of work today on wisdom of crowds, in which there is some objective measure, and then you have a bunch of people and you find a median or mean kind of way of aggregating. But of course, in anthropology, as I was taught, because I'm not an anthropologist, it's not proper to think that you have to have necessarily have an objective basis for determining what is true and false. So the questions are about knowledge, not about personal opinion. They can be developed in various questionnaire formats. And I'm going to focus early on in the true-false format. It's easy for individuals to answer true-false, but you only get one bit of information per person per question. And so it's better if you can do other kinds of questionnaires, sophisticated enough to do that. So for every questionnaire format, cultural consensus theory provides a parametric cognitive model about how a testable parametric cognitive model about how an informant would go about answering a question if they have in the back some kind of a consensus truth. The models are like models in psychometric test theory. That's an area I'm fairly familiar with, except in psychometric test theory, a person thinks they know the answers. And then they grade the person against their accuracy in reconstructing the answers. But in our case, we don't know the answers, so we treat them as latent variables in the mathematical model, things to be estimated rather than to be assumed a priori. So the researcher selects questionnaire format, generates M questions pertaining to the unknown shared knowledge, and collects responses from calling them informants, to the M questions. And so the basic data, the basic data consists of what we call a response profile matrix. Well, we've got to get that back. A response profile matrix where xik is a random variable, which is the response of informant I to item k. And then, of course, the actual data is a realization of this matrix of random variables. You can have some missing data, but it's best, as we'll see in the example I'm going to give, if you have most people answering all the questions. Now, what we want to do with the response profile data, with the realization of this, is we want to decide if the statistical model we're using is valid in assuming that the group shares a consensus. And if the evidence statistically is that it's valid enough, then we want to estimate the consensus answers and perhaps the cultural saliency of each question. In other words, you may have a series of questions in which some aspects of the culture are known to almost everybody and others are less well known, even though there's a consensus. And we also want, if we've decided the model we're using is okay, we want to estimate the level of expertise and possibly the response biases of the characteristics of each informant. In almost all the questionnaire designs, if you don't know the answer, some people pick a true more often than a false. Some people do the opposite. In Likert scale, some people use the middling ones. Some people use the extreme ones. So what we want to do is model the bias in such a way that we can filter it out. In other words, we're not particularly interested in the bias. And if we don't have evidence that the model is signaling a single culture, then we want to determine if the informants can be divided into several subgroups, each with its own consensus answers. And if the evidence, and I'll show you how we decide that, if the evidence is okay for that, then we want to detect the groups, and we want to detect either using covariates or more interestingly, I think, using a finite mixture model version of the cultural consensus model to estimate things. Now, these are some areas where all the earliest work and most of the work that use cultural consensus is in ethnographic studies, like folk medical beliefs and things of that nature. But these are some of the areas that we and other people have gotten into determining perceived or actual relations in a social network. In other words, when the network ties are not logically defined, like co-authorship, you want to ask several people and aggregate their information. Determining the syntactic acceptability of sentences in a language, aggregating forecasts, pooling judges' rankings. One of my students was a ballroom dancer, and they revealed a whole bunch of judges, and you could each see where they sat and where they watched and all that. We wanted to see if they had biases. Determining what actually happened from eyewitness reports. There's a case where you may not have a ground truth. Determining consensus grades of essay questions by multiple graders or cross-cultural comparisons of groups. Those are all areas where cultural consensus has been applied. So the original CCT model, this is the paper that most people have cited and know about, a paper by Romney, Weller, and myself called Culture as Consensus, and it was in American Anthropologist. And it posed the model I'm going to talk about, which is an early version with some, not as full a version as we have now, but and the mathematical and statistic properties. Well, I'm not an anthropologist, and I'm not even much of a computer person, but I do a lot of math and statistics, so that was my angle in the project. And so we worked out a lot of the mathematical details of the model, and Steve Borgatti, a graduate student at Irvine at the time, actually programmed software for the estimation theory. We were real proud of the estimation theory because it was clever, but it was terribly inefficient from a statistical standpoint, and yet Steve was able to get something where you can push the buttons and get the answers, and unfortunately, in my opinion anyway, that's what people use. And I'm going to show you websites where you can get downloadable modern software that can do Bayesian analysis of these things. So there's been a steady stream of applications in many of the anthropological work. So let's take a look at the specification of this first model. Here we have the response profile matrix in which the random variable xik is 1 if informant I says true to item k, 0 otherwise. And now these are parameters in the model. This is the answer key. Z sub k is the latent answer to question k. And they're treated as parameters. They're not treated as things that we know a priori. Now here's a little example of how powerful this thing can be in comparison with something like wisdom of the crowds. So here you are as a TA with a easy job. You're a TA for a quantum mechanics course at Irvine. There'd only be 6 students in such a course here at Irvine. And you're the grader, and the professor has given you the 6 subjects along the rows to a 40 true-false questionnaire, if you could imagine that in quantum mechanics. And he's given you the answer key, and these are the data, and he's gone off skiing, and you're supposed to grade the exam and bring back the results. Fortunately, what happened is you lose the answer key. So now these people are a culture, right, because they've all attended the same class. Some people know more than others. So this is the data. We can see that a couple of people got all falses, a couple of items got all falses, and I think there are 4 of them that got all trues. There's actually 8 of them that have a 3-3 tie. So the question is, how could you reconstruct the answer key and try to save your job? Well, you can pose a null hypothesis that P is a half and try to reject it. It turns out 6-0 splits you could reject at the 0.5 level. But 5-1, 4-2 splits you couldn't touch with the old classical P of 0.5 type of thing, and you sure aren't going to get any 3-3 splits decided that way. Now, you could be a wisdom of the crowds person and say, let's just go with a mean, but you would be a bit queasy about 4-2 split when the prof comes back and says, hey, come on. 4 people got that one wrong, and 2 of them got it right. So we analyzed the data with what's called the general Condorcet model. I won't go into history of why we called it that, and I call that the GCM1 because that's the one that most of the anthropologists actually use. And so we used Bayesian statistical inference. We selected an ignorance prior, which is appropriate. If you don't know the answers beforehand, you assume that they're all equally likely. And notice that in Bayesian inference, what you do is you get a posterior distribution of all your parameters. So let's just focus on 1zk. That's either 1 or 0. That parameter will have a value 1 or 0. So there's a distribution over those 2 units, 1 and 0. And the mean of that posterior distribution is what you would be looking at. If you were good at getting that mean close to 0 or close to 1, then you would be fairly confident in how you managed to do this. Well, here is a plot. Incidentally, the data were generated from the general Condorcet model 1, but we didn't use any of the parameters in the simulation. We just simulated the data table. Well, the squares are the true answer that was used in the simulation, and the circles are the posterior means. And what we did is we decisively got the posterior in 38 of the 40 questions to be very close to 1 or 0. We missed 2 of those 3-3 ties, but we got 6 of the 3-3 ties. And actually, question 7 had 2 trues and 4 falses, was nevertheless classified as true. Now, how in the heck did we do this? Well, imagine an individual that, let's say you have a series of questions and you look at the majority response to each question. Let's say you have somebody that's almost always on the side of the majority. That guy probably knows a lot more than somebody who's flipping back and forth. Well, that isn't how we estimate it, but in the model, implicitly, that's the way that individual differences in knowledge are coming out in terms of the pattern of their responses relative to the group responses. Let's see what we're doing here, my goodness. So let me tell you how this model works. Let's just take a single item and a single subject, a single informant, and we can understand it from this tree. Either the correct answer is true or the correct answer is false. If the correct answer is true, the person either knows the answer with probability d sub I being the informant, or with 1 minus d sub I, they don't know the answer, and then they guess. In the original model, they guess 50-50. We didn't have a bias. Later on, we'll show you how we put a bias in there. On the other hand, if the true answer is false, then they either know the answer and they say false, or they don't, and they guess 50-50 guess. And from that, you can derive the conditional marginal, that the probability that you will get a certain response, 1 or 0, depending upon the d and the z, is 1 plus d over 2 if the person matches the answer key, 1 minus d over 2 if they don't match the answer key. Now, there is a fact in the model, because what I just showed you was only for one item and one subject. Let's go back to the entire data matrix. There, you would expect a lot of covariation among these different random variables. For instance, if 3 people told you that question 1 was true, it'd be better an even bet to bet that the 4th guy is going to say true, right? These items are not independent. Well, the trick in mathematical modeling in these cases is that you try to make the probability of this matrix of random variables conditional on knowledge of the parameters to operate like this. In other words, here's the probability of a realization of this random matrix given the knowledge of each person and the correct answers, and then it cracks out into a giant product of individual marginal probabilities conditional on the parameters. That's an important assumption in a lot of models, that when you have a matrix of data, which is all over psychology, where you have a bunch of people that answer a bunch of items, that you try to get rid of the dependencies in the structure by conditionalizing on the parameters. Now, it doesn't work in network theory. It's much more complicated because the covariation among the ties in a network are much, much more complicated to get off into the Hammersley-Clifford theorem or something of that nature. Deal with that. But here, this works very nicely because from this, you can get the likelihood function of the model. Going back, of course, to the tree, that gives you each of these individual terms, and then you have the likelihood function, and then if you're going to do maximum likelihood, try to maximize. If you're doing Bayesian, you get a prior, and then you have to go off into a Markov chain Monte Carlo estimation or something of that nature. Now, estimation theory. Well, we were clever, but we were very inefficient from a statistical standpoint. We figured out a way to get a crude estimate of the D's. And given the estimate of the D's, we were able to get a Bayesian estimate of the answer key by assuming a priori all the answer keys are equally likely. And now we have the individual D's, and it works out to be this kind of cute formula that we're going to estimate that the kth question is really true if and only if the sum over informant's of twice their response minus 1, which signals 1 if they say true and false if they say a minus 1 is for false. And then there's a weighting, which is the log odds that they're correct. This is a log odds formula. If you take that log odds out of this equation, you have the majority rule. You're just adding up the 1s and 0s. So this is why this thing is doing better than just a majority rule if indeed there's a differential competences and so forth. So this is another way in which it differs from wisdom of the crowd. Now there are limitations in this model, and it failed to model possible heterogeneity in respondents' guessing. There was no adequate test of the one culture assumption. There is a false test, as Uska knows. I'll talk about it probably a little coming up. It failed to model possible heterogeneity in item difficulty. It could not incorporate respondent covariates in the estimation theory. Now you can estimate the parameters like the D's, and if you have some kind of covariate, you can correlate, but that's the wrong way to do it. What you want to do is regress the parameters in the model on the covariates and carry out the estimation that way. And it couldn't handle more than one answer key. In other words, what if you actually have a mixture of people that have consensus? It was restricted to true-false questionnaires. It actually, you could do some multiple choice with it. And it didn't use hierarchical Bayesian estimation, which is a coda for most statistical work today. So let's see how we fixed it up. Let me see how we're doing with the time here. They're moving. Well, we'll see. So we revised to overcome all of these limitations. And it's like pulling teeth to get, you know, researchers are very conservative. When it comes to social life, they're very liberal. And so, you know, the new cars, new phones, new TVs, they go for them. But when it comes to a thing you can push buttons and get the answer, and somebody comes along and say, we got a better thing, they want to continue to push the same buttons that they did. So we've had a lot of fun teasing them about that. The bibliography has a lot of recent papers that you'll see that have downloadable websites on how to do this sort of thing. So let's, and of course we have developed these models for other than true false. So let's go with moving in the guessing. So this is very simple. You just say the answer is either true or false. You either know it or you don't know it. Now we throw in another parameter, g sub I, which is the probability that person I, not knowing an answer, will guess true. And that, in some studies, that varies from person to person. We continue with the conditional independence assumption. I'm not going to show it again. And this is the marginal that you would need in that. Remember, the conditional independence assumption, you have the probability of the giant matrix is this giant product, and this is how you're getting those individual terms. We had the idea, but we didn't know how to do the estimation theory. We had the idea, we didn't know how to do it. Now, this is the important result, I think, about an adequate test of the one culture assumption. It turns out from the models that I've given, including the ones I'm going to develop, there's a theorem. This is not a use of factor analysis as a data reduction. There's an actual mathematical theorem that if you correlate each pair of informants across the items, and you create a matrix of those correlations. Here, of course, it's a fourfold. It's a Pearson correlation on a 1-0 thing. So you can prove a theorem that the correlation between two individuals over items is the product of each of their correlations with a latent truth. Of course, you don't have the latent truth. And what this is a version of Spearman's Spearman's old tetrad. Remember, Spearman was one of the first people to have an intelligence model. He said basically there was an individual intelligence component, and then each test had its own specifics. And he used test-test correlations to decompose and estimate the individual's intelligence. Of course, he just set out a stream next. It was 3 types of intelligence, 5, 7, 9. But anyway, he had 2. This is exactly the same thing, except we're correlating pairs of informants, not pairs of tests. And so this is the theorem, and the consequence of it is that there's a testable fact. In other words, if you put in the empirical correlations between pairs of people across items, they're approximately equal to a row vector times its transpose. And these AIs are estimates of the unknown correlation between each individual and the answer key. And we used a minimal residual factor analysis to estimate this, but it's very easy just to do least squares. It does least squares to estimate these things. And so let's go back to that little example I gave you. And suppose now we're doing a proper factor analysis of the correlation matrix. This is our idea for a posterior Bayesian model check. What we did is we got the scree plot. We took the informant-informant correlations, factor analyzed it, and we got the series of eigenvalues that you get in singular value decomposition or principal components or factor analysis. They all give you that kind of stuff. And this black line is for that exam, that quantum mechanics exam. And now we know that unless the data are multivariate normal, you don't have any way of knowing how many significant factors they are and how many are fit in the noise. But what we did is using a Gelman's idea of post-predictive testing, what we do is during the Markov chain Monte Carlo estimation, the Bayesian model, you're moving around the parameter space. So what we do is and you're trying to sit over the parameters that are more likely than the other ones, right? That's the whole idea of the algorithm. So what we do is after throwing the burn-in period away, we snag a parameter in the Markov chain sequence. We simulate a data set of the same size as the one we collected. We calculate their eigenvalue series, and then we move the MC to another place. We grab a parameters there. We knock off another data set. We got the eigenvalue series. And so this little smearing is what happens when you do 500 of those things. And what you want to see is that the black line, the real data eigenvalue series, falls within this. We're not doing a statistical test, but it's one of a battery of post-predictive tests that you imply that you use to decide if you like the model. Well, I'll just do some data. Let's see what we have. I'm not sure how much time. I'll go a little over 30 minutes, but.
Well, our next talk starts at 8:50.
Okay, and it's. Okay, and then I'll try to go. I can't see where I am now. Okay, I may go a little over the 8:40, but not too far. So this is an old data set that Susan Weller, one of the early workers and it's typical of a lot of the ethnographic studies. She found some female urban Guatemala informants and about 27 diseases, which they back translated to Spanish and so forth. She asked them for each disease whether true or false is it contagious, and for each disease does it need a hot or a cold remedy. That was something that was in the anthropological idea. And so we analyzed those data with a GCM1, and we reanalyzed it with the current model. And these are the eigenvalue series, a very nice, sharp one factor for the contagion data. And here we have a scree plot of eigenvalues, which clearly doesn't show a one culture pattern, but it could be that people don't know what the heck, hot, cold, what does it have to do anything, or it could be that there actually might be two different cultures, and I'll say something about that in a second. So anyway, what about differential item saliency? I think in the interest of time, I'll go quickly with it. We just changed the model where we put DIK here rather than DI. In other words, DIK is the probability informant I knows the answer to item K. Well, immediately there are too many DIKs because there's just as many DIKs as there are data points. So we've got to do something to knock down, and we use the Roche model. How many people have ever heard of the Roche model? It's a way of having a independence in a 1-0 in a probability, analysis of variance. No interaction would correspond to what it's doing. I'm not going to describe how we do it. Whoop. Well, I meant to go past it, but not that fast. So we actually model it with a version of the Roche model. Now, incorporating Bayesian inference. Well, George Karabatsis and I in 2003 were the first to do a serious Bayesian analysis of the GCM2 along with software. And it fell completely on deaf ears because, well, I've got a thing on people to push buttons. But in any event, the Bayesian inference is especially suited for models that have this kind of a data structure. In fact, throughout cognitive psychology, you ask a bunch of people a bunch of questions. Recognition, memory, all kinds of paradigms involve a bunch of people and a bunch of questions. The reason that Bayesian inference is very good for that kind of a thing is that you have on the inside, on the subject side, you may have one or two, several kinds of parameters, and they form bundles. And you can easily model heterogeneity in the bundles of the parameters for the subjects if you work in that way. And also the items, the M items, may have one or more parameters. And then if you go hierarchical Bayesian, you can assume that these parameters for the items fall from some hierarchical distribution, and on and on. It's in the papers. This way one can work with a model of such data without making unrealistic homogeneity assumptions. For years and years and years, cognitive modelers, of which I was one of them, used to use the assumption that all the subjects are the same. And that made the model very easy, but it's false. Now, Zita Orachevich, she's currently a professor at Penn State. One of my postdocs is very good at psychometrics, and she's worked ways of putting covariates into the estimation process. All right. So since the Karabatsis thing went on deaf ears, Zeta decided to develop something. I don't know if you ever say, this looks a little like Borgatti's Anthropac thing. So we decided we would set up a GUI, graphic user interface, that looked like the old one. Maybe then people would be more likely to use it. So here what you do is you decide whether the competence is the same for everybody or heterogeneous. Is the guessing bias a half for everybody, or is it heterogeneous? Is the item difficulty the same for all items or not? You decide on those things. You decide on how many chains on the Markov chain and so forth and so on. Push a button, and then it turns out a thing. Now that's downloadable. It isn't hierarchical. Later on, Zeta worked the hierarchical, but it is fully Bayesian, in which you could get individual differences in the parameters. Incorporating multiple answer keys. Well, the evidence, in case the evidence is strong for one culture, is not strong, there are two possibilities. There are two or more cultures, or it's a bunch of hash. You know, the model runs on the data. So even if the data has no signal in it about competence, it's going to run. And we extended the GCM to cover more than one culture as a finite mixture model. Here's the idea that this is the correct answer for subject I to item K is either true or false, and we go down the same tree as before. Now we have a nice theorem. This one surprised us. The theorem is that if you have the multicultural GCM, and you take the correlation between two informants across items, it factors into a product of three things. The correlation between the person and his own answer key, the next person and their own answer key, and the correlation between the two answer keys, which would mean in a scree plot that you would get more than one factor. And sure enough, here is the eigenvalue series for the hot-cold data. And using this and also using DIC and some other statistical things, we were able to show that the hot-cold data actually had two cultures, but they weren't interesting. It was like you get a disease that you can't think about hot and cold. Certain people respond this way, other people respond another way. But this one was a great success because Ruska has this wonderful article, which the title of which is here, in Field Methods, in which he challenged the Borgatti program because there was a huge ratio of the first to the second eigenvalue. And that was the test these guys were using to decide whether there was one culture. It was 10 to 1 or something like that. But Ruska knew that from covariates that there were some, most of the people were answering the questions the same way, but there was a small subset of questions that were differentiable by covariates. So we actually applied the multicultural model, and we got two cultures out of it. And notice this looks very much like a scree plot. It has a little bump here for the second factor that you would be inclined to say there's only one there, but actually using DIC and some other measures, we were able to argue there were two. And so there was a small number of trained nurses and a few people that had done birth attendant experience. And we picked a small culture of those people, and there was a huge culture of the other people. And furthermore, the two answer keys shared a lot of items, so that those were masking the idea of getting pretty good. A couple of minutes, I'll try to. So variations. One last story here. Some people allow a don't know response. We had tangled with a sociologist who asked questions about science. And it turns out women are a little more likely to use the don't know response than men, and then they go and they call don't know an error, right? So we extended the model to you either know it or you don't know it, and then you're willing to guess or you're not willing to guess, and then you guess true or false. We can actually estimate differential tendencies to go with don't know. That we applied that. We had to go through 3 iterations with the referees to get this past a guy who thought he couldn't believe there'd be false science, right? There's only true science in people that make errors. Well, that's not true. Application to networks. Yeah, we've got models for tie-based and nodal-based models. Did West and Baylor play the same sport would be a nodal-based model, and does Idaho and Colorado share a border would be a tie-based model. And the interesting thing about this is that the individuals can make all kinds of responses, some of which are incompatible. If West and Baylor played the same sport and Baylor and Chamberlain did, obviously West and Chamberlain would, but they don't have to answer that way. But the MC had better get an answer key that satisfies these side constraints. So that's kind of fun. And let's see. Oh, yeah, and I'm going to show you the last slide in just a second. But many cases you can imagine cultural truth to be continuous. What is the probability the next president will be a woman, for instance, is something you wouldn't say true or false. You might have a continuous slider. You might have a Likert scale. So we've got models for those. And the beautiful thing about these models is the same theorems hold. In other words, if you've got one culture, we use true score theory in psychometrics to set up the model. And we model the bias and how you use these scales. And we still get the two theorems that I showed for most of the models. I call it the continuous truth model. Let's see. Yeah, then some other CCT models. We've got models, this is the second to last slide, models for rank orders, models for matching questions, first names and last names of philosophers. The only thing the Irvine people got was the car logos in the cars. They could get those. The first and last names of philosophers, they weren't good at that. Models for psychophysical judgments where truth is positive valued, models for pair comparison judgments, models for triad judgments. So this is the paper in press. Apparently, the Stevens Handbook is sort of the Bible for experimental psychology. They're having a new edition. We were invited to do a chapter in the Stevens Handbook on methodology, the one edited by E.G. Wagenmakers, and we have a nice article in press that I'd be willing to send you that covers the continuous models in some detail, and now we're anxious to see that one come out. So that's